Alright, what's up? It's the Ascension of Babylon. What we do here is we talk about the occult, we talk about spiritual self-development, and we talk about the healing process. So if that's your thing and you're not subscribed, absolutely hit that subscribe button and go ahead and drop a like too. As well, if you have any feedback or you want to share any personal experience, you can do that in the comments, and I will do my best to comment back, and let you know what I think about whatever you're saying. But your input is absolutely valued, especially when it comes to a video like this, because I'm going to be sharing my experiences with something that so many of us have been through, or maybe are even actively going through in the present moment. So I'm going to be sharing my experience with substance abuse, and I'm actually also going to be talking about how the occult actually saved my life. And that's not something that happened right away. It actually made my substance abuse a lot worse at first, and we'll be getting into why. But it did lead me to kind of this point of no return where I could not have the same relationship with unhealthy coping that I had had when it was kind of driving me unconsciously, and even when I was aware of it, but I was still just unable to get out of those cycles. So substance abuse for me started, I would say, in my very early teenage years. I never really had a great relationship with my parents. There was a lot of trauma that took place in the household. I ended up on the streets at a very young age, clothes in a bag, eventually committing violent crimes to survive and to fit in and things of that nature. I had friends that were certainly not the healthiest. I ended up becoming a gang member. I ended up in juvenile detention very early, and then those cycles of incarceration continued throughout all of my teenage years, and up into a lot of my adulthood, until I finally ended up deciding that I was going to break those cycles. And when it came to being in the streets and this entire identity that I had kind of created, I mean, look at my face, this is a part of an old identity that I used to have. It had its roots, of course, in trauma, but also in addiction and in unhealthy coping, and more specifically in relation to the topic of this video, substance abuse. So, when I was very young, I started smoking marijuana. This led to me experimenting with pills. I would take Xannies and, Percocets and muscle relaxers, really whatever to bring me away from this internal misery that I was experiencing. Anything to kind of just get me out of my body to where, I didn't have to feel what I was actually feeling inside. I had a lot of neglect and a lot of abandonment and things of that nature that I had no idea how to process, and I just didn't want to feel. So substances was really my way out. And of course, alcohol was something as well. I wasn't like a heavy drinker, but I would end up getting quite drunk sometimes, and just drinking in a way that was unhealthy. I wasn't like a heavy drinker or an alcoholic, but I certainly had my cycles where maybe I was, or maybe I would get really intoxicated. And these cycles followed me into my adulthood. And it put me in a lot of very dangerous circumstances and things of that nature. And bottom line, it just took me away from feeling what I actually needed to feel to break out of all the other cycles that I was trapped in, and to be more authentic to who I really was. And being authentic is something I spent my whole entire life running away from, but I had the nerve to project myself as if I was being authentic or if I was being real, when I was just running away from all of these wounded parts of me, existing in cycles of incarceration, and just, running away from what those parts were really feeling by abusing substances and committing violent crimes and things of that nature. But this video is more about the aspect of the street life. It's more about it's more about substance abuse and that aspect of things. So yeah, I struggled with cycles of substance abuse for a very long time. And a point where I got really bad, I actually got addicted to Suboxone. So Suboxone is like this, I believe it's known as an opioid blocker that most people will take to basically stop doing fentanyl and other things that are considered to be opioids. But if you weren't really like a fentanyl user, or you didn't have a high tolerance to it, you could take Suboxone and get really fucked up, and it gives you like this very euphoric kind of feeling. And although that wasn't really like my drug of choice, or not something that I would do on the streets or when I had my freedom, this is something that I would do when I would get incarcerated from time to time. But the last time that I got locked up, I did 4 years, to where I split about half of that time in county. Or actually, no, I spent a lot of that time in county. But I also spent some time in state prison. I spent a lot of time kind of like fighting my cases, and I used to get in a lot of trouble and a lot of violent altercations. So I also got sent to multiple different county jails during that time as well, before I went to state prison. So it's during these 4 years that I did that I got very addicted to Suboxone, because it's so easy to get inside of the joint. I mean, there's a lot of people that knew how to get it in the mail, and I'm not going to give too many details, but I myself was a person that was conspiring to get this substance in. So like, I would conspire with other people to get it in, and, let's just say it would find its way in, right? And, there were times where I had a lot of Suboxone. I was making money, I was doing my thing, and I did spend a lot of my time kind of living in a way where I didn't really go without too much in there. So for those of you that don't know, you can, like, if you have the money, or even like your people are sending you money, you can order commissary, and you can have people order you books and things of that nature. So this bid, even though there's bids where I've kind of struggled, this was a bid that I did really well for myself. I had people supporting me, and I was also kind of doing my thing with the Suboxone in different ways. So the reason why I'm saying that is I got very addicted to it because it was always around. I started doing little pieces of it, but this turned into me needing to do a lot of it, and into me needing to do it every single day, to where if I didn't have it, I would withdraw. I would get sick. I would have so much anxiety. I would feel very, very weak. I wouldn't be able to sleep. I would go into these really, we can say, dark mental and emotional states and things of that nature. And it was just a bad time, especially to be in jail and to be sick and to feel like that vulnerable, especially, being someone like myself that was always involved in violence and gang conflicts and stuff like that. I mean, that was not a great space to be in. But the fact of the matter is I was very addicted to Suboxone, and I was taking large quantities of it literally to the door. So even in state prison, I was doing Suboxone, and then eventually I ended up getting released. And when I got released, I was fucked up. I was high. I remember kind of waiting in the processing holding tank type area, waiting for my people to come pick me up so I can experience freedom. And I remember just being high even then. So yeah, I got very addicted to this substance, and I came home with this addiction. And when I came home, eventually I stopped using it. But where this kind of led me is to like, it led me into like using other things. So I was smoking weed very heavily. From smoking weed, I would have to drink. I was smoking a bunch of cigarettes. And eventually, I actually started using fentanyl perks. Now, this only lasted for a short time, but this put me into some very dangerous circumstances and experiences. And I actually believe that at the time, I was with this person. This person was my partner, my girlfriend, and I actually think that she almost died a couple of times. But I was so desensitized and just in these cycles of trying to numb myself out that I didn't necessarily take it very seriously. Like I didn't really think about it too deeply into like much later, kind of just reflecting back on it. But there's times where like her lips were blue and I couldn't get her up and I had to shake her up or kind of like get her in the shower and stuff like that, and she was fine after. But we were in some very toxic cycles together, sniffing these fentanyl perks. A lot of people die from fentanyl perks because you don't really know how much fentanyl is in the perk. You never know. There's no way to regulate it. So one day you could do a bunch and be fine, and then the next day you could do the same amount and actually OD and die. And I think that even though I tried to be very careful with it, and so did she, I think both of us were actually close to that point. Now, I did stop using the fentanyl perks, but this led me back into drinking and smoking marijuana and always needing nicotine. And I just continued on in these cycles. Now, at the time, I was performing a lot of different occult rituals. In fact, I started doing this very habitually while I was incarcerated. And I've made videos about this before. But basically, like, while I was in the joint, I started working with forces like Lucifer, Azazel, Baal Hadad, Beelzebub, Abaddon, Mot, and all different types of primal, we can say, multi-dimensional fields of energy or extraterrestrial beings, calling these energies into my body. And I went through a lot of major changes to the point that I walked away from the gang life, and I started really shedding a lot of layers of the identity that I was so attached to before that I would have never let go of if I didn't start performing these different occult rituals that kind of initiated these death cycles that pressurized my identity to such an extent that I actually almost got to see it like, I think this is the best way to put it, kind of like in the third person, like almost like higher self to human self, kind of looking down on myself almost. And I started to see things from this elevated, clearer perspective to where I'm like, I don't want to be this person anymore, but I didn't know how not to be that person. And this is why I really started like getting worse with the substance abuse as well, because I didn't know how to process the changes that I was going through, and I didn't know how to shed the whole gangster identity. I was a very violent person. A lot of people like knew me for being somebody that just got it shaken. I just got down, and even some of the most violent, dangerous people that, I knew would look at me as if I was the fucking crazy one. And this was like how hard I went for like that lifestyle that I used to live, and this is how hard I went to uphold this gangsta persona type of identity. So as that started dissolving, as I'm doing like these different occult rituals and I'm working with these, we can say, higher fields of energy and things of that nature, doing these different invocation practices that were causing a lot more change than I knew how to process, I started grabbing on to more and more unhealthy coping. So this, led to me being like addicted to Suboxone when I was inside the jail. And, then my addictions on the streets, they didn't get any better, and that led me to like doing fentanyl pills for like a short period of time. So that's what I meant by like the fentanyl perks, the pressed 30s. And this led me into some really negative, toxic kinds of cycles, because I didn't really understand how to process what was coming up. So when you're performing the types of occult rituals that I was doing, it's going to bring up suppressed traumas in the form of the emotions that, a lot of us spend our whole entire lives creating identities and belief systems and things of that nature to bypass and to keep us from processing. But I got to the point where I had to work harder and harder and harder and harder to bypass those things, because it was all coming to the surface. Mind you, while this is happening, I had no idea that this was actually happening to me. So I was operating in this like very unconscious kind of way, going through like a deeper initiatory process, because I was working with a lot of this very intense ritual magic and these very powerful beings. And, once again, I was kind of operating in this unconscious way, to where I was using these substances, wondering why I had such a strong desire to keep using substances, and why I was getting just worse and worse and worse in my substance abuse. So, once again, I get out of prison, and I start using things like fentanyl for a short period of time. And even when I wasn't using that, I couldn't like go a day without smoking weed. Not only a day, I had to do it multiple times a day to even feel safe in my body, because of all that stuff that was coming up from this massive evolutionary process that I initiated, and that I started initiating very heavily when I was in the joint doing all these rituals. And, I would have to drink alcohol and, do other things just to try to keep myself together, because I was being torn apart. And it was the old me that I was still latching onto, and I didn't really know that's what I was doing, because, I kind of let go of the whole gangster persona. I wasn't in the streets riding around with a firearm trying to kill anyone anymore, or any of the old stuff that the old me would do. But the substance abuse was still attached to the old me, and I was hanging onto it for dear life, because I couldn't process the passing and the death of that old self that I had let go of in a healthy way. And I didn't really know how to be anyone else. So I was just in this space where, without actually knowing it, I felt completely lost, and I was being pushed into levels of vulnerability that I didn't yet have the capacity to process. So this is what translated into that heavy substance abuse. Now, over time, I started working with the substance abuse in a healthier way. I started to come across sources of information involving trauma and nervous system regulation and different healing modalities that actually helped me understand what was going on in my system and how that was related to different parts of me. So I started to realize that, the addiction isn't random. It's a protector part of me that's trying to keep me away from other wounded, buried, suppressed parts of me that it thinks is dangerous for me to interact with. So as I'm still working with the occult to a much higher capacity, in fact, I'm going through the clip-off and I'm going through deeper levels of occult initiation. Although I wasn't perfect with the substance abuse, I was able to let the substance abuse go. And at this time I'm speaking about, of course, I wasn't using like heavy substances or anything like that, but I was like smoking cigarettes and smoking marijuana and drinking here and there. which was, I was still abusing the substances, but it was like a tree that I was slowly chopping down, and I was slowly building a healthier relationship with the energy of addiction in myself, to where, I started really transmuting a lot of that energy and expressing it in a way that was actually truer to who I truly was, rather than just operating from this addiction that once upon a time was completely running my life. And in many ways it was like this inner demon that was controlling me. But, over time, as I was working with the clip-off, which is a form of underworld initiation, I was very willing to travel into that inner hell, to where I befriended these inner demons enough that were carrying the addiction. So by inner demons, I mean suppressed, fragmented parts of me that just needed love and attention and needed me to connect with them. Well, this is when the cycles of addiction started to end, and I would be able to actually put something down like weed and put it down for a significant amount of time before I ended up like picking it up again. And I would pick it up again, and then I would put it down, and I would pick it up, and it would be the same thing with nicotine. I would, put it down and then pick it up. I put it down for like a year. Then I might pick it up again for a much shorter amount of time, and then I put it down and picked it up, and I went through like these different cycles. And it led me to where I am today, to where I have a much healthier relationship to unhealthy coping than I've ever had, to where, I don't spiral in patterns of addiction. Now, there is times where here and there I might smoke some marijuana, or I might pick up a cigarette, but it's a much different relationship than I had before. And I'm always able to like put it down. And each time I do it, for the most part, I'm able to put it down for like a longer period of time. And I've been able to like regulate my nervous system, and I've been able to really step into my authenticity in a way that I was not able to do before. But this took time. It took training myself into a more present moment state of awareness, and it also took, when I would go back into cycles of unhealthy coping in relation to substance abuse, the ability to not shame myself for doing it, because the shame, if I shamed myself, it would hold me in those cycles even longer. So there's times where it was actually somewhat of a healthy thing to do, or at least the next best choice I could have made, to where I needed to actually smoke some of those cigarettes, or I needed to actually smoke some of that weed, or maybe drink a little bit of that alcohol, to not only understand where I was truly at with this addiction, but to help me also form a healthier, more present moment kind of relationship with the part of me that still had some of that, we can say, addictive tendency or addictive energy in it, to where I could go without these substances for quite some time, and then out of nowhere I might want to use it. And then, I start kind of feeling shame and all these different emotions around it, because it's like, I've done all this work, why do I want to use this substance? And then, there's many times where I would go into using that substance and I would shame myself. I would sit up at night, my inner critics coming online, like, what are you doing? You're supposed to be being, you're supposed to be being authentic. That sounded weird in my head when I said that. Hopefully that's what, hopefully that came out right. Anyways, you're supposed to be being authentic. You're supposed to be doing this way, and you're not doing it. What's wrong with you? And it, even though we can say it, ideally that's not the choice that we want to make, a part of substance abuse healing, or healing through substance abuse, is actually sometimes going back into it without judging yourself and without shaming yourself, communicating to the part of you that, you know what, I love you where you're at, and we're going to go into this substance, or we're going to smoke this cigarette, or have a couple cigarettes, whatever it is, but we're not going to do this forever. This is not something that's going to be a continual thing. So as I started approaching it in this way, my relationship with substance abuse began to change. But if I shamed or judged myself, it held me in cycles of substance abuse to where it was like this repetitive thing that I couldn't put down for longer and longer, until I accepted myself exactly where I was at. And now in today's, present moment, I live a very different lifestyle. I have much healthier relationships, and my outer reality, although I'm not perfect or anything like that, there's plenty of things that I need to work on and that I'm healing through and that I'm currently becoming aware of within myself. My outer reality has shifted so much as my internal state has also shifted. So I think this is really most of what I wanted to share today. This is my story on substance abuse and kind of where I'm at with it today, So if you're watching this video and you watched it all the way through, thank you so much. I appreciate every single one of you, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.